Hi guys, Olive here today to bring you the next installment in my ongoing series of videos all about the 90s PBS Kids TV show, Wishbone. If you're one of the unlucky few who has never seen an episode of Wishbone before, then I will tell you that it was a half-hour television program directed at children, and every single episode was split down the middle into two different storylines. In the first storyline, the writers of the show adapted a famous work within the literary canon. Now, most frequently that was a book, but it could also be a short story, a play, a myth, a legend, a folk tale, anything like that. And then in the second storyline, we get to meet a 1990s family living in Texas with their pet Jack Russell Terrier Wishbone, and their storyline always tied back to the literary adaptation in some sort of a thematic way. In this series of videos I do here on my channel, I look at one episode of Wishbone per video, and I compare it to the source material that they worked with for that episode. Then I start asking some questions. What did they choose to keep the same from the work? What did they change? Why did they maybe make some of those choices? Did they pull any kind of moral message out of the source material to communicate to the young audience of Wishbone? Did they make the audience of Wishbone want to go and read that book, play, short story, etc.? Eventually, did they capture the spirit of that work? And then finally, was it an entertaining episode of television? In today's video, we will be looking at a late season 1 episode of Wishbone titled Panton at the Opera that takes on, you guessed it, the gothic romance novel The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. Let's take a look. What's the story, Wishbone?
What's the story, Wishbone? What's this you're dreaming of?
At the start of this episode, the kids decide to swing by the library to research their report on rock and roll for music class, and they say hi to Joe's mom, Ellen, because she works there. While they're at the reference desk saying hello, Ellen shows them that she's been featured in the latest issue of the Library Monthly magazine because she's been digitizing her library's reference catalog. While the kids are browsing the stacks, a shadowy figure seems to be following them. He finally introduces himself as Mr. Knudsen and tells them exactly where they can find the books they're looking for. But Joe gets weirded out when Mr. Knudsen says that he's the reference librarian, since that library only has one reference librarian, and that's Joe's mom, Ellen. When they try to find him again and ask him about the mix-up, he is nowhere to be found. Mr. Knudsen's mysterious disappearance leads Wishbone to introduce the novel, The Phantom of the Opera, which takes place in a grand Parisian opera house in the 1870s. A ghost has haunted this opera house for many years, and management has always worked to appease him with a salary and his own box, but the management has recently changed, and they stopped providing these services, and everyone starts to fear that the ghost is about to take his revenge. Viscount Raoul de Chagny, played by Wishbone, is at the opera one night, and he's wowed by the performance of a new singer, Christine Daae. But he's less impressed by the lead performer, Carlotta, whose performance is disrupted by frog noises coming from her throat. We can see that the faceless ghost is responsible for that and what comes next. He cuts down a sandbag, which almost lands on Carlotta, then places a smoke bomb in the box that's normally his, driving everyone out of the opera house. Back in Texas, the kids tell Ellen about their ghost, Mr. Knudsen, and she tells them that he was the one who created the reference system that she's actively digitizing, but that the kids couldn't have possibly seen him, since not only did he retire a decade ago and move to Florida, but he died a few weeks prior. His wife wrote to Ellen and told her about his death. Ellen thinks that someone must be playing a prank on them, but when she shows the three kids his obituary, the man in the picture is exactly who they saw. Everyone is trying to think of a logical explanation when Ellen gets a call telling her that something strange is going on at the library, so they all head over there. In the book adaptation, Raoul, goes to Christine's dressing room to speak with her, when he sees her being coached by a mysterious person who is so clearly in love with her. But when Raoul makes himself known, the figure disappears. Christine and Raoul then speak, and they realize that they know each other from childhood. But Christine in that moment is afraid to show too much affection toward Raoul because she confesses that her music teacher is the opera ghost, and he is very jealous. To protect Raoul, Christine insists that he leave. When everyone arrives at the library back in the real-life storyline, they discover a missing volume of the index that Ellen has been working with, and more than that, someone has also vandalized Ellen's magazine feature, implying that she's stolen something by working on her project. The group of them decide that they'll camp out in the library that night to see if the mysterious perpetrator comes back to steal more volumes of the index. They also call in reinforcements, namely a police officer and Wanda, who is taking the whole operation far too seriously. After the automatic lights all go off, they all prepare for the stakeout. While they're waiting for their culprit to come back, Raoul in the book adaptation defies Christine's orders and shows up at one of her rehearsals. Christine again voices concerns that Eric the ghost will harm Raoul if they're seen talking, so Raoul proposes that they run away together. Christine agrees, but only after she performs one final time that evening. But in the middle of her performance that night, she's kidnapped by the Phantom through a trapdoor. Raoul quickly chases after them. He follows the sounds of music through the bowels of the opera and finds Christine and the masked Phantom Eric, but Eric traps Raoul and states his intention to marry Christine. Everyone is ready to meet their ghost back at the library that night. Everyone hears a noise around midnight, and then none other than Mr. Knudsen comes skulking into the library. When he's confronted, he admits that he was the one who wrote the letter to Ellen claiming he died. He had seen her magazine profile and become furious that he wasn't credited for the system he created, his life's work. Ellen explains to him that she didn't write that article. And then when she shows him the digital system, she shows him that she named it after him and gave him full credit for it. He apologizes for his behavior, and he and Ellen talk more about the system, and then continue that conversation over dinner that night. Things come to a head in the book adaptation as well. Eric, the opera ghost, laments his lot in life, but when Christine shows him kindness, he changes his tune and releases both her and Raoul after he makes them promise that they'll visit him in the future. So let's talk about this episode, and I will start off by saying, wow, this was a really dense episode of Wishbone, and I don't mean that in a bad way. The Phantom of the Opera has a very complex story, so even going into this episode, I anticipated that they would need to dedicate a lot of this episode just to explaining that story, but I wasn't anticipating that they would also introduce an almost equally complicated real-life storyline. There was zero filler content in this episode, zero quiet moments, zero dead air. Occasionally in Wishbone, you'll see some things included just to take up time. Not the case in this episode. They needed every second to be able to focus on those two very complicated storylines, and I think it added to the overall tension of this episode. In terms of how faithful they were to the story of the Phantom of the Opera, they did dramatically condense the events of the book. Everything that happened in the episode pretty much does happen in the book, just over a much longer span of time, but they needed to mush everything together and have it happen a lot quicker. And of course, they did also omit quite a bit. Like the managers of the opera house, for instance, they're referred to in this episode, but we don't get to meet them in the way that we do in the book. We don't get to find out about any of their drama surrounding stolen money, their drama with the box attendant of box number 5, who actually looks out for the opera ghost. There is no mention of the character of the Persian. He is a pretty big character in the book, but they just left him out entirely. And then there's also no mention of a dead stagehand, which happens right at the beginning of the book. But the condensed version of the story that they show us in this episode, I would say it's fairly accurate. And I would say most importantly, it captures the essence of the Phantom of the Opera. It will give you a good idea of what to expect if you go on to read the novel. But if you do go on to read the novel, there is one big change between their adaptation and the novel that I wanted to highlight. Because that sandbag that the ghost cuts down in this adaptation, yeah, in the novel, that's a chandelier, and it kills people when it falls. I think they changed that because this is a kid's show. They don't want to show the opera ghost actively harming people. But also I think they changed that because it would have affected their decision right at the end of the episode to have Christine tell Eric, the Phantom of the Opera, that he's a good man. Is he a tragic figure? Absolutely. A good man? That's debatable, but I think for the purposes of the moral message, they wanted Eric to be a good person. They needed that line in there because I think the moral message they were trying to communicate in this episode is that good people sometimes do bad things, especially when they're feeling overlooked or unappreciated. That's true of the opera ghost. That's true of Mr. Knudsen. It's a very quiet moral message in this one. I had to really think about what they were trying to communicate. They're so busy telling both of the stories that they don't spend much time highlighting the moral message in this episode. Alternatively, I guess they could have gone with a moral message of, before faking your own death, maybe consider making a phone call. I will be the first one to admit that that real life storyline was so over the top. It was so much. But actually, because it was kind of like a soap opera, it fit the novel quite nicely because The Phantom of the Opera is hands down the most melodramatic book I have ever read. I loved it, but it was so crazy. And so I guess they went hand in hand. It was a nice echo of that melodramatic novel, so I applaud them for that. And also that real life storyline was wildly entertaining. I swear when Ellen told the kids, no, that guy you saw, that couldn't have been Mr. Knudsen because he's dead, I was gripped. So I have to say, this was an excellent episode of Wishbone. Sure, that moral message was very subtle. They could have made that a little bit more apparent. And that change about the character of Eric, I didn't love that. But everything else about this episode, I really enjoyed. I think they gave us a really clear picture of what to expect from the novel. They kept enough things faithful that you could feel what it would be like to read it. And then they paired it with an equally entertaining real life storyline. I was really entertained the whole way through. I thought it was really fun, really well balanced, and appropriately melodramatic. I loved it. But those were my thoughts on this episode of Wishbone. If you have any of your own, I would love to hear from you in the comment section below. And if you would like to see more of these What's the Story Wishbone videos, I have made a playlist that contains all the ones I've done up to this point. It will contain all the ones I do in the future. I'm planning to go through all of them. And so if you're looking for a specific episode, if you have a favorite, you want to see if I've covered it, or if you just want to watch them all from the very beginning, I will link that playlist for you in the description box below and up in the cards. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.
Funding for Wishbone provided by annual financial support from PBS viewers like you.